It sits right in the middle of the 20th century, sandwiched directly between the monumental triumph of World War II and the intense cultural upheaval of the Vietnam War. Because of that, you'll often hear it referred to as the Forgotten War. But honestly, why? Why does a conflict that literally built the framework of our modern world so frequently slip from our collective historical memory? Today, we're exploring this pivotal moment through a rather unique lens. Okay, let's dive into this explainer and uncover the immense weight of the Korean War.
You see, there's this profound void in Western memory when it comes to the years 1950 to 1953. People tend to skip right over it. But while it's constantly overshadowed by WWI and Vietnam, this was absolutely not just some minor skirmish. Actually, this was the very first hot military clash of the Cold War. It was the absolute testing ground that set the template for the global containment of communism. The strategies, the borders, and the alliances forged in the fire of this conflict, they didn't just stay in the 1950s. They left a permanent legacy that actively shapes Asian and global politics right this very second. So to really understand how we got here, we've got to look at how the stage was set.
And honestly, the stage was set with a simple, arbitrary line drawn on a map. Following the defeat of Japan in World War II, the Korean Peninsula was suddenly free from decades of Japanese occupation. That sounds great, right? But the Allied powers, specifically the US and the Soviet Union, needed a way to manage the territory. So they made this massive, world-altering decision incredibly casually. They arbitrarily divided the entire Korean Peninsula right across the middle, right along the 38th parallel. Now, it was meant to be temporary, but, well, as we know from history, temporary borders drawn by superpowers, they rarely stay temporary for long.
That single line birthed two entirely different states, and it directly mirrored the brewing Cold War. Up in the north, the territory was occupied by the Soviet Union, and they installed Kim Il-sung to develop a hardline communist state. Down in the south, the United States backed Syngman Rhee, who formed a fiercely anti-communist, authoritarian capitalist administration. Now here's where the friction really starts. Neither of these leaders accepted that 30th parallel. Not at all. Both Kim Il-sung and Syngman Rhee claimed sole, legitimate rule over the entire peninsula. The tension was just boiling over, and violent border skirmishes became a really common, deadly occurrence. It was basically a powder keg just waiting for a spark.
And when that spark finally hit, the conflict was definitely not a slow, static crawl. The war violently whiplashed through 4 distinct, high-stakes phases that caught the entire world completely off guard. The pacing was just incredibly rapid. We're going to walk through each of these 4 phases so you can truly grasp the scale of these crazy momentum shifts, starting right with the moment that powder keg finally exploded.
On June 25, 1950, Phase 1 officially begins. Backed heavily by Soviet tanks and heavy artillery, the North Korean People's Army launched this massive, devastating surprise invasion right across that 38th parallel. The South Korean forces were just completely overwhelmed by the sheer force of the attack. Within mere weeks, a massive wave of North Korean tanks aggressively pushed South Korean and arriving U.S. forces all the way down into a tiny, desperate defensive pocket on the southeastern tip of the peninsula, a place known as the Pusan Perimeter. At that point, it looked like total defeat was imminent. But then came Phase 2. This was marked by one of the most brilliant and audacious military maneuvers of the entire 20th century. General Douglas MacArthur, who was commanding a newly formed United Nations coalition made primarily of U.S. troops, executed a wildly audacious, high-risk amphibious landing deep behind enemy lines at Incheon. This move completely blindsided the North Korean forces and decisively cut off their supply lines. Because of this, UN forces rapidly broke out of the Pusan perimeter, recaptured Seoul, completely shattered the North Korean army, and pushed the front line all the way north toward the Yalu River, which, crucially, is the border with China. But the tables turned yet again. By November 1950, Phase 3 begins. Chairman Mao Zedong grew deeply anxious about having a hostile U.S. military presence sitting directly on his border. Now, what's really interesting about this slide is how he responded. He sent hundreds of thousands of Chinese People's Volunteer troops surging right across the frozen Yalu River. They completely blindsided the UN forces, who honestly thought the war was all but won. The sheer scale of the Chinese offensive abruptly halted the UN advance and totally reversed the entire momentum of the war practically overnight. This dramatic reversal led to some of the most harrowing combat of the entire war, specifically the legendary Battle of Chosin Reservoir. The conditions here were just apocalyptic. Surrounded U.S. Marines were forced into a brutal, agonizing retreat through treacherous mountain terrain in temperatures that literally plummeted to 30 degrees below zero. It's almost unimaginable. Ultimately, the Chinese forces pushed the UN coalition all the way back down the peninsula, and incredibly, Seoul was captured by communist forces for a second time.
The UN forces did eventually rally, launching a counteroffensive that managed to push the front line roughly back to where it all began, right in the vicinity of the 38th parallel. And this ushers in Phase 4. From 1951 to 1953, those sweeping, dramatic momentum shifts abruptly stopped. The war devolved into a grinding, agonizingly slow stalemate. The combat actually began to eerily resemble the trench warfare of World War I. For 2 bloody years, soldiers fought and died over highly fortified hills and ridges. The front lines barely moved an inch, while frustratingly slow peace negotiations just dragged on in the background.
Finally, by 1953, sheer exhaustion had set in on all sides. A major turning point occurred in March of 1953 with the death of Joseph Stalin. This was huge because it removed one of the primary communist backers pushing to continue the war. His death opened up a narrow window for compromise, and on July 27, 1953, the Korean Armistice Agreement was officially signed. But here is the absolutely crucial point you have to remember. An armistice is merely a formal military ceasefire. It's not a peace treaty. So to this very day, technically speaking, North and South Korea remain in a state of war.
Before we look at the legacy, we have to just pause for a second and really absorb the terrifying balance sheet of this conflict. This was not some minor, distant clash. The human cost was simply astronomical. We're talking an estimated 2 to 3 million civilians killed. That is a staggering toll for just a 3-year span. Militarily, the United States lost around 36,000 personnel, while Chinese military deaths are estimated at up to 600,000. On top of that, intense U.S. strategic bombing campaigns wreaked absolute havoc from above, leaving nearly every single major city, town, and industrial center in North Korea utterly flattened into ash and rubble. The true scale of the destruction is just really hard to fully comprehend.
Out of all this devastation, a new border was drawn, the Demilitarized Zone, or the DMZ. And this brilliantly illustrates the lingering tension. It's a 2.5-mile wide strip that aggressively slices right across the peninsula near that original 38th parallel. Now, despite its name being demilitarized, this 2.5-mile strip remains the most heavily fortified, tense border anywhere on planet Earth. It is completely lined with landmines, barbed wire, and thousands of troops staring each other down, 24 hours a day.
Now, if we zoom out from the peninsula for a second, the geopolitical legacy of the Korean War literally reshaped the globe. This war was the main catalyst for the modern era of American military posture. The sheer shock of the conflict terrified the West and prompted the United States to massively accelerate its military spending, establishing the sprawling network of permanent military bases across Asia and Europe that still exist today. Plus, to prevent the broader spread of communism, the U.S. dispatched its 7th Fleet to the Taiwan Strait during the conflict. That decisive action cemented the U.S. geopolitical shielding of Taiwan, a dynamic that, as you probably know, remains one of the most critical flashpoints in modern global relations.
But perhaps the most profound legacy of all is the permanent splitting of a shared destiny. Just because of that arbitrary line, a deeply homogeneous culture with thousands of years of shared history was violently cleaved into 2 radically different worlds. Look at it today. The North is a deeply isolated, nuclear-armed, dynastic totalitarian state. The South, by stark contrast, rose from the ashes to become a vibrant, technologically dominant, democratic superpower. These are 2 completely divergent realities, born from the exact same peninsula, separated only by a 2.5-mile stretch of landmines. So this leaves us with a lingering, truly vital question. Are the permanent scars of the Cold War still bleeding today? The Korean War might be labeled forgotten, but its consequences are clearly anything but in the past. From the threat of nuclear proliferation in the North, to the economic powerhouse of the South, to the military posturing over Taiwan, the shockwaves of those 3 bloody years between 1950 and 1953 continue to dictate the very framework of our modern world. It really makes you wonder, doesn't it? How long can a ceasefire hold before the forgotten history demands to be remembered?